Welcome, friends, to a brand new science fiction story. In this episode, I'll be telling you the story of Leonardo, the alien queen Adeline, and her paralyzed little daughter. Grab your coffee and let's start enjoying the story together. Happy viewing. I treated the alien queen's little daughter, who was paralyzed. She ran up to me and said, "Will you be my dad, human?" The shuttle came down through a sky the color of bruised apricots, and Leonardo, gripping the armrest hard enough to leave fingerprints in the alloy, made a private vow that whatever happened on this planet, he would not vomit in front of the aliens. It seemed like a low bar. It was, he suspected, going to be the defining achievement of his week. He had crossed a distance that his brain, a modest organ trained mostly in the diseases of one small blue-green world, flatly refused to comprehend. The paperwork had said 4 months in transit. The paperwork had not mentioned that the last stretch of descent would feel like being posted through a letterbox by an enthusiastic child. When the shuttle finally sighed to a halt and the door irised open, the light that poured in was warm and gold and smelled, impossibly, of rain and cut grass and something sweeter underneath, like the whole planet had been dabbing on perfume for company. Leonardo unbuckled, stood, promptly cracked his head on the doorframe, and stepped out onto the surface of another world, rubbing his skull and swearing in a language nobody here would recognize. The terrace stretched out before him in pale, luminous stone, ringed by columns that were not carved so much as grown, each one twisting up like a frozen jet of milk toward a canopy of floating gardens that drifted overhead with no visible means of support, trailing vines that dripped tiny points of light. Somewhere water was running. Somewhere, faintly, music. It was the single most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and his first coherent thought was that his cheap boots were leaving dusty prints all over it. His second thought was that everyone here was extremely, unfairly tall. They came toward him in a loose procession, the Ilvari, and Leonardo had studied the briefing files. He really had. But the files had been flat little pictures, and these were people, 7 feet of them, easily. Skin in every shade of blue from pale morning sky to deep ocean trench, moving with the unhurried grace of creatures who had never once tripped over a coffee table in the dark. And the ears. He'd known about the ears. Knowing had not prepared him. They swept up and back from the sides of each head, long and tapering and faintly translucent at the tips, and they moved, flicking, tilting, turning toward sounds like satellite dishes with opinions. His own ears, he became suddenly and painfully aware, were 2 small pink commas stuck to the sides of his head like afterthoughts. At the center of the procession walked the queen. He knew it was her before anyone said a word, the way you know which way is down. Adeline did not wear a crown so much as carry an absence of doubt. She was robed in something that shifted between silver and deep blue as she moved, and her face was the sort of compose that takes years of practice and a great deal of disappointment to perfect. A stillness held on purpose. Her eyes found him, took his measure in a single unhurried sweep from crown to dusty boots, and gave nothing back. "Physician Leonardo," she said. Her voice was low and even. "You are shorter than I expected." "I get that a lot," said Leonardo. "Usually not in the first 10 seconds, but I appreciate efficient people." Something moved at the edge of the queen's mouth and was ruthlessly suppressed. Beside her, a tall Ilvari male in the deep green robes of a healer made a small noise through his nose that conveyed, across every barrier of species and space, the universal sentiment of, "Oh, wonderful, this one thinks he's funny." "This is Adrian," the queen said, "who has cared for my daughter since her birth. He will assist you." From the way Adrian's ears flattened a fraction, assist was doing a great deal of diplomatic heavy lifting. "I look forward to it," Leonardo lied warmly. And then a smaller voice, bright as a struck bell, cut clean through the courtly hush. "Is that him?" She was seated in a chair that floated a hand's breadth off the ground, drifting forward on its own like a leaf on a stream. And she was perhaps 6 years old, and she was the most alive thing on the entire terrace. Princess Luna's skin was the soft blue of a summer dusk, her dark hair escaping its braids in rebellious wisps, and her ears, smaller than the adults, still growing into themselves, quivered with undisguised fascination. Her legs lay still and neat beneath a blanket, motionless in a way the rest of her plainly was not. She brought the chair right up to him, close enough that he had to look down, and studied his face with the frank scientific ruthlessness only small children possess. "Your ears," Luna announced to the assembled court, "are sad and small." She tilted her head. "Are all humans broken like that? Or is it just you?" The terrace went very, very quiet. Leonardo crouched down until they were eye to eye, ignoring the twinge in his knees and the 4 months of travel that lived in his spine. "Just me," he said gravely. "The rest of them are worse. You should see my brother. No ears at all. Keeps his sandwiches in there." Luna stared at him. Then she laughed, a sudden, delighted, entirely unroyal shriek of a laugh, and somewhere above them a bird that was not a bird burst upward off a floating branch in a scatter of light. Leonardo, watching that laugh crack across the child's whole face, felt the first small, dangerous root of something take hold in his chest, and did not yet know enough to be afraid of it. Behind them, the queen watched. She said nothing at all, but her ears had turned, just slightly, toward the sound of her daughter laughing, and stayed there. They gave him a laboratory that had clearly once belonged to someone important and dead, all high windows and polished stone benches worn smooth by generations of hands larger than his. And Leonardo spent his first working morning discovering that not one single piece of his equipment wanted to be there. He'd hauled it across 4 months of void, the diagnostic sleeve, the neural mapper, the little handheld scanner that had gotten him through a plague year on a mining colony, and every device, upon meeting genuine Ilvari physiology for the first time, reacted with the stunned horror of a tourist who had ordered the mild curry. The scanner beeped. Then it beeped again, faster. Then it produced a sound he had never heard it make in 11 years of ownership, a sort of despairing electronic warble, and displayed a readout that his translator rendered as error. Blood is the wrong color. "It's supposed to be that color," Leonardo told the scanner. The scanner did not believe him. Adrian watched all of this from the doorway with his arms folded and his ears at the precise angle of a man who has been proven right before lunch. He had arrived promptly, robed in that deep healer's green, and had so far assisted by standing very still and radiating the opinion that a species which had, in Adrian's memorable phrasing, only recently stopped dying of the small deaths in the mouth. Teeth. He meant tooth decay. Leonardo had eventually worked out, had no business laying hands on an Ilvari child. "Your machine is frightened," Adrian observed. "He's overwhelmed. First day. New planet." Leonardo gave the scanner a companionable pat. "We've all been there. We have not all been there." But the ears twitched just once, and Leonardo filed that away. The man had a sense of humor buried down there somewhere, under about 400 years of institutional certainty, like a coin dropped behind a very heavy cabinet. The real work started when they brought Luna in and Leonardo stopped performing entirely. This was the part nobody who hadn't done it understood, that a good examination was 90% conversation and 10% instruments, and that with a child it was closer to 99. So he did not lunge at her legs with a probe. He sat on the floor, which put his head roughly level with her knee and delighted her enormously, and he asked her about her chair and how fast it went and whether she had ever crashed it into anybody important. She had. A visiting ambassador, on purpose. She was not sorry. And while she talked, he watched. He watched her toes. He watched, for a long time, one small azure foot, and when a spindly six-legged insect the size of a thumbnail wandered across the sunlit floor near her ankle, he watched her foot flinch. Not move, not step, but flinch, a fast, involuntary curl, there and gone. Leonardo's heart did something complicated, and he kept his face perfectly bored. "Do that again," he said. "The insect thing." "I didn't do anything," said Luna. "Your foot did. Traitor foot, working behind your back." She giggled and looked down at her own foot with the deep suspicion of the betrayed, and Leonardo, still smiling, was already 3 rooms ahead in his mind, because a limb that flinches is a limb the brain can still find in the dark. The wire was not cut. The wire was merely, very badly, connected. It took him another 9 days to be sure. Days of tests his machines slowly, grudgingly learned to run. Days of Adrian hovering and Adeline appearing silently in doorways and vanishing again. But when he was sure, he asked to see the Queen, and he laid it out for her plainly in the high room with the water running somewhere beneath the floor. "Your daughter's spine is intact," he said. "Her muscles are thin, but they're alive. This isn't damage to the body. When she was small, she took a fever." "The burning season," Adeline said. Her voice did not change. Only her hands, folded in her lap, pressed a little tighter. "She was 2. We nearly lost her." The fever scrambled the signals, the way a storm knocks out the connection between 2 towns that are both still standing. He leaned forward. "The road is washed out, but both towns are there, and roads can be rebuilt, slowly, badly, 1 stone at a time. It would take months. It would hurt her sometimes. It would fail, often, before it worked. And I can promise you nothing at all except the work itself." For a long moment the Queen was silent, and Leonardo watched something war behind that composed and lovely face. Watched a mother who had, he understood now, been handed hope by clever men before, and had it die in her hands. 14 healers, Adeline said at last, quietly, have stood where you are standing. Some of them very great. They told me she was fragile. They told me to keep her still, keep her safe, keep her seated. 3 of them promised me she would walk. Her eyes came up to his, and there was something raw underneath the ice. "I do not want your hope, human. I have buried more hope than you have years. Hope is a debt that comes due at the worst possible hour." "Good," said Leonardo, "because I'm not selling any." He held her gaze without flinching, which took more nerve than he let on. "I don't do hope. Hope's for people who want to feel better without getting their hands dirty. I do work. Boring, ugly, repetitive work, and most of it won't show for weeks. And some days will go backward, and I will need you to not fire me on those days, which will be hard, because on those days I'll be insufferable." He spread his hands. "That's the whole offer, Majesty. Sweat, no promises, and a doctor with tragically small ears." And there, at last, after 11 days, the corner of the Queen's mouth betrayed her. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of the memory of one, gone almost before it arrived. But Adrian, standing by the door, saw it too, and his ears, Leonardo noticed, flattened right back down. The work, as promised, was boring, and Leonardo loved it the way he loved all boring things that were secretly holy. They built the road 1 stone at a time. Every morning he strapped Luna into a harness of his own devising, a cradle of soft straps and a hovering counterweight that took most of her weight off her legs so that her legs had only to remember they existed, not carry a whole princess into the bargain, and every morning she informed him it was undignified. "Ambassadors," she said gravely, dangling 6 inches off the floor, "do not wear these." "Ambassadors," said Leonardo, "crash their chairs into people. You're already more dignified than the ambassador." This was unassailable, and she knew it, so she settled for kicking him gently in the shin with a foot that, 3 weeks ago, had not kicked anything at all. That was the thing nobody who wasn't in the room could feel, the size of small. An outsider watching would have seen a child hanging in a harness twitching her toes for an hour while a short human muttered encouragement and a scanner made anxious noises. They would not have seen that on the 11th day the left foot pressed down, deliberately, onto the floor, bearing perhaps the weight of a folded blanket. Leonardo saw it. Leonardo had to turn around and pretend to adjust a dial so that a 6-year-old would not watch a grown physician's eyes go hot. The days stacked into weeks and the weeks into a rhythm. Luna shrieking with triumph one morning, hurling a cushion at his head the next because the exercises hurt, and she was tired, and being brave was exhausting when you were 6. He let her throw the cushion. He always let her throw the cushion. A child who could still get angry was a child who still believed something was worth being angry about. And somewhere in all of it, Adeline stopped standing in doorways. She came in properly now, at first with the excuse of matters of state that plainly could have waited, and then without any excuse at all. She would fold herself onto the low bench by the tall windows. She was too regal to sit on the floor, though Leonardo suspected she wanted to, and she would watch, and slowly, session by session, she began to talk. Not to him, exactly. To the middle distance, in the safe cover of watching her daughter, in the way people confess things to the side of your face that they could never say to the front of it. He learned the shape of her over those weeks, the way he'd learned the shape of Luna's damage, by watching what flinched. He learned that the late king had been gone 4 years, taken not by any enemy, but by a failure of the heart so ordinary it was almost an insult, here in a palace that could grow columns out of light. He learned that ruling alone was a particular kind of cold, that a queen may be surrounded at every hour and touched by no one, that Adeline had trained herself so thoroughly never to reach for a thing she could not survive losing, that the reaching muscle had gone the way of Luna's legs, intact, alive, and utterly out of practice. "You do it too," she said to him once, unexpectedly, her eyes still on her daughter. "You keep yourself back, behind the jokes." "The jokes are load-bearing," said Leonardo. "Take them out and the whole building comes down." She almost smiled. She was getting worse at not smiling. He counted this, privately, as a second patient making slow progress. And then came the morning the road washed out again. Luna had been standing, actually standing, both feet, 30 full seconds, the harness slack, and she had looked up at him with her whole face on fire with pride, and something in her back had simply seized. Not pain first, terror first, the terror of a body that had betrayed her once already doing it again, and then the pain, and then her legs folding under her like paper and Leonardo lunging to catch her before she struck the stone. The scanner screamed. The muscles had locked, cramped down hard around the fragile new pathways, and by afternoon she could not press the folded blanket weight she'd managed in week 1. The court felt it move through the palace like a change in air pressure. He heard it in the healer's silence at dinner, saw it in the particular gentleness with which servants avoided his eyes. The Humans Project is over. Nobody said it. Everybody said it. Adeline said nothing to him at all, which was worse than anything she could have said. He found her that night in the therapy hall, long after the moons had come up and thrown their pale double light across the empty harness. She was standing where Luna had stood. She did not turn around. "I told you," she said very quietly. "I told you I did not want hope." "This isn't hope failing," Leonardo said. He came and stood beside her, not too close. "This is the cramp. The muscles woke up and panicked. It happens with every nervous system I've ever met, human or otherwise. You teach a limb to work after years of silence, and the first thing it does is overreact, like a dog that finally gets let off the lead and runs straight into a wall." He exhaled. "We eased off too fast. That's on me. We slow down. We go back 3 stones and lay them again. And if it happens once more, and once after that, then we lay them a 4th time." He looked at her, really looked, at the queen with her armor off in the moonlight, at the exhaustion she never let the daylight see. "You've buried a lot of hope, Adeline. I believe you. But I've watched that girl press her foot into the floor on purpose. That's not hope. Hope is a feeling. That was a step, and steps are just physics, and physics doesn't care how many times your heart's been broken." For a long moment she did not move. Then, slowly, without looking at him, in the dark of the empty hall where no court and no crown could see her do it, the Queen of Ilvar reached out and rested her hand on his arm, and left it there. Neither of them said anything. It was the first honest silence between them, and it held. The delegation arrived on a ship that made Leonardo's shuttle look like a thrown shoe, and it brought with it 3 things he had been dreading without quite admitting he was dreading them: a treaty, a lawyer, and a calendar. The treaty was between Ilvar and the loose federation of worlds that had technically employed him, a grand document about trade corridors and mineral rights, and the sort of language that takes 10 pages to say we would like your rocks. Leonardo cared nothing for the rocks. But buried in the treaty, in a subclause so small it must have been drafted by someone with excellent eyesight and no soul, was a provision about the exchange of specialists. And it turned out that Leonardo was a specialist, and specialists had contracts, and contracts had end dates, and his was written in ink that had dried a very long time ago on a very distant world where nobody had known there would be a small azure foot pressing down into a stone floor on purpose. "You're being recalled," the lawyer explained, not unkindly. He was human, the first human face Leonardo had seen in half a year, and he found, to his surprise, that it did nothing for him at all. "The Institute has 3 colonies mid-outbreak and 1 physician of your grade sitting on a diplomatic posting treating a single patient. From their chair, it looks like waste." "From my chair," said Leonardo, "it looks like a child learning to walk." "From their chair, that's sentiment. Sentiment doesn't fill out the requisition forms." The lawyer slid a slate across the table. "They've authorized a completion bonus, generous. You'd never work another shift you didn't want to. All you have to do is sign, board the ship, and let the court healers manage the maintenance from here." The bonus was, indeed, generous. It was the number you offer a man to make leaving feel like a decision instead of a defeat. Leonardo looked at it for a long time and felt absolutely nothing except a low, stubborn heat behind his sternum. Adrian, of all people, was the one who put the hard truth on the table, and he did it in the Queen's presence, in the high room with the running water, because Adrian at least had the decency to say cruel things to your face. "I do not say this to wound the human," Adrian said, which was how Ilvari always opened when they were about to wound you thoroughly. "I say it because I have watched this court for 200 years. 3 healers promised the princess would walk. Each time the Queen believed. Each time the believing broke something in her that took years to set." He turned to Adeline, and his voice gentled in a way that told Leonardo the man had loved this family long before Leonardo had ever heard their names. "He has done more than the 14. I concede it. Before witnesses, I concede it. But he leaves either way, Majesty. Today by treaty, or in a year by some other paper. And a hope that walks out the door on its own 2 legs wounds worse than one that never stood at all. Let it end cleanly. For her sake. And for yours." It was, Leonardo thought, the worst kind of argument. The kind made in good faith by someone who was not entirely wrong. He looked at Adeline. Adeline looked at the middle distance, her hands folded, her face closed back up into the armored stillness he hadn't seen since his first week, and he understood that Adrian had reached her, that she was weighing a crown's obligations against a child's chance, against a thing neither of them had ever once said aloud, and that a queen was not permitted the luxury of choosing with her heart. "I need to think," she said, and swept out, and the water ran on underneath the empty room. He didn't pack. That was the whole of it, really. He sat in his dead important person's laboratory with the slate and the generous number glowing on it, and the ship sitting fueled on the terrace, and he found that his hands simply would not do the packing. He picked up the scanner. He put it down. He told himself all the sensible things a sensible man tells himself. He was a doctor. There were colonies dying. Sentiment did not fill out the forms. Every word of it was true, and not one word of it moved him an inch toward the door. It was Luna who cracked it open, the way children crack everything open, sideways and without mercy. She had wheeled her chair into the lab to watch him not pack, and she studied him with that frank, scientific ruthlessness, ears tilted. And then she said, "Mama's eyes went funny when the ship came." "Funny how?" "Wet funny." She hid it. Luna considered him. "Your eyes go funny, too, when she's in the room. You think nobody sees, but I see everything. I am extremely observant." She frowned, 6 years old, and closing on something with the terrible directness of the young. "Are you going away, human?" And Leonardo, who lied to patients for a living, gentle, useful lies, "This won't hurt, and you're doing wonderfully," found he could not manufacture a single one for her. "I don't want to," he said. "Then don't." She said it like it was arithmetic, like the road washing out was a thing that happened to legs and not to grown men with contracts. "That's not an answer," he told her. "It's the only one that matters," she said, and wheeled off to lunch, leaving him sitting there with the glowing slate and the fueled ship and the appalling suspicion that a child had just out-argued an interstellar lawyer, a 200-year-old healer, and every sensible thing he had ever told himself, all before her midday meal. It happened on a Tuesday, or the Ilvari equivalent, which is to say an ordinary morning wearing no special clothes, because the enormous things in life have a cruel habit of arriving disguised as the small ones. Leonardo had not signed the slate. He had not boarded the ship. He had, instead, done the only thing he knew how to do when the world got too large, which was to go back 3 stones and lay them again, easing Luna's legs down slow after the seizure, coaxing the panicked muscles to unclench, rebuilding trust between a body and its own frightened wiring one unglamorous morning at a time. The ship sat fueled on the terrace like a guest who has been asked to leave and is pretending not to hear. The lawyer sent one polite reminder a day. Leonardo replied to none of them, which was, he was aware, not a strategy so much as the absence of one, so they were simply working. The harness hung slack in its cradle. She'd graduated off the full counterweight a week ago, taking real weight now, standing for whole minutes at the rail that ran the length of the sunlit hall. Adeline was on her low bench by the tall windows, robed in morning silver, and Adrian stood near the door in his green with his arms folded, because Adrian came to every session now, ostensibly to supervise, actually because he could no longer stay away. The water ran somewhere beneath the floor. A bird that was not a bird sang in the floating gardens overhead. It was, in every measurable respect, a completely unremarkable day. "Rail to the window," Leonardo said. "Same as yesterday. Slow. I've got you." She had done it before, hand over hand along the rail, her legs learning the old forgotten grammar of left, then right, then left. She gripped the rail. She set her feet. And then Luna, 6 years old, blue as summer dusk, stubborn as her mother and twice as reckless, looked down the long, empty stretch of sunlit floor between herself and the human crouched 20 feet away, and made a decision that no one had authorized. She let go of the rail. Leonardo's heart stopped. He saw Adeline half rise from the bench. He saw Adrian's arms come uncrossed. Luna stood swaying, holding nothing at all. And then she took a step, not a harness step, not a rail step, a real one, into empty air, into open floor, her whole weight balanced on 2 legs that 6 months ago had never carried her anywhere, and it wobbled and it was ugly, and it was the single most magnificent thing Leonardo had ever seen a body do. She took another. Her face broke open into astonishment, then into a wild, delighted joy, and she did not stop to be careful because she was 6, and careful was for ambassadors. She broke into a run, a stumbling, pitching, gloriously unsteady run, arms out, braids flying straight down the length of the great hall on legs that had decided, all at once and all on their own, to simply work, and the whole sunlit room stopped breathing. She crossed the floor in a scatter of small, thunderous footsteps, and she reached him, and she threw both arms around his legs and clung there, and looked up at him with her entire face shining, and asked the question that no healer, no lawyer, no 200 years of court wisdom had thought to prepare him for. "Will you be my dad, human?" The hall went silent, not the polite silence of court. The other kind, the kind that falls when something true has been said too loudly in a room full of people who have all spent their lives saying careful things. Somewhere the water ran on, oblivious. Adrian stood by the door with his jaw somewhere near the floor and his ears gone perfectly, uselessly flat, 200 years of composure abandoning him all at once. And Leonardo looked down at the child wrapped around his knees, at the small azure face turned up to his, and every load-bearing joke he owned deserted him at the exact moment he needed one most. He looked up. Adeline was standing. She had come off the bench without knowing she'd done it, one hand pressed hard against her mouth, and the armor, The careful, terrible years in the building armor was simply gone, cracked wide open down its whole length, and behind it was a mother watching her daughter stand. Yes, but it was not only that. It was not only about the legs anymore, and every soul in the room could see it. Her eyes were bright and streaming and fixed on his, and in them was the reaching muscle she had let go slack for 4 cold years, moving now, reaching, and terrified of the reach. Neither of them answered the little girl. They couldn't. The truth was too large for the room, larger than the treaty, larger than the fueled ship, larger than a crown's obligations or an institute's requisition forms, and it hung there in the sunlit air between the physician and the queen, in a silence that trembled, that said everything the 2 most cautious people on the planet had spent 6 months not daring to say. Luna, still clinging to his legs, glanced from one adult to the other, from the human whose eyes had gone wet funny to the mother whose composure had shattered, and being extremely observant. And 6, she drew the obvious conclusion. "You're both doing the funny eyes," she said, delighted and appalled. Finally. The trouble with a truth too large for a room is that it eventually has to fit through the door. They did not settle it that afternoon, the 2 most cautious people on the planet. Luna's diagnosis notwithstanding, funny eyes are not a treaty. What settled it was smaller and slower and far more like Leonardo. That evening, after the child had been carried off to bed still narrating her run to anyone who'd listen and several who wouldn't, he found Adeline in the therapy hall, in the double moonlight, standing where she'd stood the night the road washed out. This time he did not wait for her to reach for his arm. This time he crossed the floor and took her hand, plainly, the way Luna had let go of the rail, into open air, into empty space, betting his whole weight on legs that had gone slack for years. "The jokes are load-bearing," Adeline said, not turning. Her voice was unsteady. "Take them out and the whole building comes down. You told me that." "I lied. Bad habit. Gentle, useful ones mostly, but that one was just cowardice." He held her hand and did not let go. "The jokes aren't load-bearing. You are. You have been for months, and I've been standing behind them like a man hiding behind a curtain that stopped covering anything a long time ago." He exhaled. "I don't want the completion bonus, Adeline. I don't want another shift I get to choose. I want this one, the boring one, the one that goes backward some days, if you'll have a doctor with tragically small ears." She turned then, and the armor did not come back up, and that was answer enough. But she gave him the words anyway, because a queen who has spent 4 years never reaching does not do things by halves once she starts. What she said was hers and stayed in that room. What mattered was that when she'd finished saying it, she was laughing and crying at once, and Leonardo discovered that the reaching muscle, once remembered, works exactly the way legs do, badly at first, and then all at once, and then like it never forgot. The paper was harder than the feeling, as paper always is. But the paper, it turned out, could be beaten, and it was Adrian who showed him how. The healer came to the laboratory the next morning, robed in green, ears at an angle Leonardo had not catalogued before, and set a slate on the bench. Not the lawyer's slate, a different one. "I have been reading your institute's treaty," Adrian said, with the eyesight of a man who has outlived 4 legal codes and holds a grudge against all of them. "Your recall depends upon a subclause governing the exchange of specialists. Specialists are, by the treaty's own definition, employees of the signatory worlds." He let that sit. "A physician who has taken residence at the Ilvari court, who has, let us say, been granted standing here by the Queen in a capacity the treaty never contemplated, is no longer a specialist on exchange. He is a subject of Ilvar. The Institute cannot recall what is no longer theirs to recall. Their forms have no box for it." Leonardo stared at him. "You found me a loophole." "I found the princess's physician a loophole," Adrian corrected. "There is a difference, and I have decided, after 200 years, that I am too old to keep pretending I do not know which side of it I am on." The ears flicked. "Also, the child would be insufferable if you left. She has already told the Kitchens you are staying. The Kitchens believe her. The Kitchens are usually right." "Adrian," said Leonardo. Was that you being nice?" "It was me being correct," said Adrian with enormous dignity, and swept out. But his ears, Leonardo noticed, were not flat, and never went flat at him again. So the lawyer went home with an unsigned slate and a headache, and the treaty got its rocks, and the fueled ship left the terrace at last with one fewer passenger than it had come for, and nobody on Ilvar watched it go. They were all too busy in the sunlit hall, where a small azure girl was learning that legs which can walk can also climb things they are absolutely not supposed to climb, to the ongoing horror of the palace and the poorly hidden delight of her physician. Because that was the thing that had changed in him, and he felt it the way you feel a bone that's finished setting, no longer tender, just whole. Leonardo had come to Ilvar a man who did work instead of hope, who kept himself back behind the curtain, who had crossed 4 months of void precisely because void was easier than staying anywhere long enough to be needed. He had told the queen he didn't do hope, he'd been proud of it. And a 6-year-old with a traitor foot had wandered up sideways and dismantled the whole philosophy, because it turned out the work and the hope were never two different things. They were the same thing, seen from the inside and the outside. And the trick he'd been missing his whole life was that you had to be willing to stand in the open floor and let go of the rail. Months later, Ilvari, months, long golden ones, there was a morning on the pearl-columned terrace, under the floating gardens dripping their small points of light. Adeline stood beside him, her hand in his without either of them thinking about it anymore, the reaching muscle strong now and unafraid. Adrian stood a little apart, pretending to supervise, and Luna ran. She ran flat out, reckless, braids streaming, all the way across the terrace on 2 legs that had once never carried her anywhere. And she did not stumble, and she did not look back, because she already knew, with the total certainty of a child who has been extremely observant her whole short life, that when she turned around, everyone who mattered would still be standing exactly where she'd left them. Leonardo watched her go. This daughter he had not signed a single form to earn, and thought about all the places in the galaxy he had crossed the void to reach, running from the next thing and the next. He had never once found what he was running toward. He had only stopped running on an ordinary Tuesday, in a sunlit hall, when a small blue hand grabbed hold of his legs and refused to let go. "You've gone funny-eyed again," Adeline murmured. "Load-bearing," said Leonardo, and did not wipe them, and held on. Some journeys, we tell ourselves, are about the destination. Leonardo crossed 4 months of empty void to fix a pair of legs that would not walk, and he did. But that was never the thing that healed on Ilvar. Because here is what the story quietly asks of you, long after the little girl stops running. How much of your own life have you spent hiding behind something load-bearing? A joke, a job, a distance you keep, telling yourself it's wisdom, when really it's only the fear of standing in the open and reaching for something you might lose. Leonardo told himself he didn't do hope. He was proud of it. He called it realism, the way we all give our fears respectable names. And it took a child who had never taken a single step to teach a grown man how to stop running, to show him that the work and the hope were never two different things at all, and that the bravest thing a person can do is exactly what she did. Let go of the rail and trust that the floor will hold. So ask yourself, tonight, in the quiet, what rail are you still gripping? Who is standing across the room from you, waiting for you to close the distance? And what might you find on the far side of that open floor, if only you were willing, just once, to let go? The void is vast, the distances are real. But sometimes the whole of a life turns on an ordinary Tuesday, on a small hand that grabs hold and simply refuses to let go. May you be brave enough to hold on when it does. The end. We've come to the end of this enjoyable story, friends. I hope you enjoyed it. Before we leave, I have a small request. Please don't forget to press the like button below and leave your thoughts about the story in the comments. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. See you in the next Sci-Fi Traveler story.